It
Okay.
wasn't letting me join in with my Google account set up to my Chrome. It was
Oh,
a mess.
that's fine. It's weird, but all right.
Okay. So where are we starting? You think?
I'm just gonna quickly send out some links to people, and and yeah, well, I'll just do like a quick intro just in case people don't know you or anything like that.
Okay, doke.
And then obviously if people come back and watch it or whatever, I'll know.
You want me to let them know? Give them the rundown.
Oh, I can let them know, or you can go ahead and let them know.
You can give the summary for sure.
Okay, so
You'd probably do a better job.
all right, so Zycron was a vegan. He no longer is. He doesn't believe that there's a moral argument for veganism.
Well, no,
Yeah.
I think that there is a moral argument for veganism, just to be clear. I just don't think that it's how a lot of vegans frame it, right?
Okay. And also he has um, a few problems with the name to trade argument. So we're just going to discuss over that basically.
Yep, that's about it. So where do you want to start? Do you want to run name the trade on me and kind of see like where you find the issues in my argument, or
Oh,
like
no,
where
I'm
we
happy
stand?
for you to just go and start picking things apart.
Okay, sure. So the first issue that I found, well, actually, the only issue that I kind of want to focus on this discussion is how name the trade is really concerned with consistency, but is completely inconsistent with itself, right?
Mhm.
And it's only in practical terms, right? So like there are ways in which you could use the argument that would be consistent, right? But it probably wouldn't produce the same outcomes that Isaac is desiring in the argument formulation.
Yeah.
So kind of the argument goes as such. So typically how people make decisions about morality is with cognitive categorization. So what you're saying is that I think something is good or bad, permissible or dispermissible. So when I'm picking or selecting a trait, what I'm saying is there's an external fact about the world, and I think that that thing is good, such to the extent that it includes humans within moral value and precludes animals. So in the same way, the vegan is saying that I find sentience to be good, right? And that includes all sentient creatures within this paradigm of moral value, right? So the selection in a meta sense is exactly the same. So that's essentially my argument boiled down.
Okay. That's, I mean, are you assuming that the person's own judgments are correct, or is there a problem with that at all? Or where's the inconsistency really?
Well, I think that the inconsistency lies in how certain people practically answer to questions through name the trait, right? So, like, if I was to say that I eat animals because it's my preference, or even I could reword it and say because I think it's categorically good, like cognitively, to eat animals, um, that people would say that that could, for one, there's two issues, right? One issue is that it, in some cases, produces a non sequitur. Because if I say that something that I think is permissible because I think it, and you appeal to what other people think, that is a textbook non sequitur, right? Because it just follows from the law of identity.
No,
So if
no.
I've like, go ahead.
I wouldn't appeal necessarily to what other people think is normal or ethical. I would just question what it is that you think is ethical, and
Mhm.
maybe push and see what the I guess take you to certain extents and see what the results of those extents are. So I wouldn't necessarily say other people think this, therefore you're wrong. I would just
Mhm.
more along the line say, if you believe this, would you be consistent in pushing along these lines, and would you hold this position all the way to this line?
Yeah, and actually, I think name the trait can be useful in those instances, right? Like there are some instances, but I don't think it's because of name the trait, right? I think it's just because it's just common questions. So if somebody says that, like, I think intelligence is, the arbiter of whether or not something has moral value, well, then obviously the question there is, where's the line? And then are you willing to like murder like retarded people? That's fine, right? There's nothing dispermissible about that in discussion, right? But the problem is that when certain people propose certain traits, and again, this is kind of the second issue I wanted to get into after the non sequitur bit, because I'm sure you probably haven't done that. But with the non sequitur bit, even after that, right, the issue with the name the trait argument is that if you're rejecting like propositional reasoning in this instance of where you're saying like, I cognitively categorize something to be good, so therefore it is good, then you've kind of undermined your own worldview, because sentiocentrism, right, in terms of like sentience is like at the epicenter of what moral value is. What you're saying is that I just cognitively categorize sentience as being a good thing, right? And I've heard the caveat being laid at the feet a lot of times in this instance would be, well, sentience is the means by which you value anything, right? So it's like, it's almost like that's begging the question though, right? Because then you're just saying that I value being able to value things. And appealing to that as if it's common sense kind of creates this kind of begging the question problem with name the trait, I feel.
Yeah, so I think you and I are coming from a different angle. So I wouldn't say that sentience is necessarily going to be somebody's thing of value. And I certainly don't think, I mean, it's almost getting to, like we talked yesterday, or you talked and I listened. And it seems like there seems to be an issue with the grounding issue where no vegans they shouldn't really say that they have deeper grounding when it comes to what it is they value compared to others. So sentience is the thing that they value, but it's not to say that it has deeper grounding than anything else that other people value.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, right? That's kind of what I find problematic about, the reasoning, right? Because, at base, really, in a meta perspective, all we're really saying when we're making a moral proposition is that we think something's either good or it's bad, right? Like, we're not making, like, really, that when you boil it down, that's really all you're saying. Now, there are external facts, right, about the world that you could point towards, right? Like, oh, well, that baby's dying over there, I think that that's bad, right? But really all you're saying is, I think that that's bad. It's not like the baby dying as an external fact about the world makes it any less true that all you're saying is, I think something is bad. So again, I feel like that's a level of analysis a lot of people who push NTT don't really consider in their lines of questioning. And I think that that's a huge issue with name the trait. But do I think that name the trait, like in terms of like, I guess name the trait has kind of become like somewhat of a hard to define argument because people use it in radically different ways. And some people wouldn't even dare to condemn the whole my preference trait on the grounds that it's somehow flawed because preference can justify anything, right? There's some people who just outright wouldn't do that. And I mean, if you use the argument in a different way, by all means, do it.
Yeah,
nothing wrong with that.
Yeah. So with I'm not really sort of following when you say if you see a child dying, that when someone says it's morally bad, that they're expressing their own view that it is morally bad. So, I mean, you and I are both in agreement that you have a subjective view of things and I have a subjective view of morality. So we're not realists.
Yeah.
Would that be accurate? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I think I guess I would be aptly described as a more relativist, but sure. Yeah, we're both subjectivist.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't. As far as that sort of scenario goes, where somebody's viewing a child dying and saying it's bad, I'm not sure it actually adds to the discussion anymore to analyze it any further and say that they are expressing their view that they view it as morally bad. I mean, if you push them on a bit further, then yeah, that's what they would eventually get to. But I'm not really sure it adds to the discussion, and I don't really know if it actually relates to name the trait at all. As far as the my preference thing goes, if you want to address that, you can go ahead.
I was just going to say it really only relates in the sense of a lot of vegans don't think that their valuing of sentience isn't just saying that sentience is good, right? That the moral kind of proposition of sentiocentrism, all that really is just looking at something like a cluster trait that we call sentience, right? And saying that I think that that is a good thing, right? So that's the kind of reasoning that you're using. And a lot of people who push name the trait kind of implicitly in their argumentation, it's clear that they don't understand that, right? That they're skipping steps because if you condemn preference, if you condemn like a categorical good, right? It shows a remarkable misunderstanding of how we rationalize to morality. That's all my point was.
Yeah, okay. So it's not so much a problem with name the trait, it's a problem with, I guess, the understanding of other people and their ability to sort of grasp the argument, and sometimes the fact that they misunderstand or they do skip over things. So it's not so much a problem with necessarily the argument, but the people that are using the argument, in that they may misunderstand, that they think that they have deeper grounding than others when it comes to sentience, when sentience is actually just an axiom.
Well, I wouldn't say, I mean, it depends on what you mean by that, right? Because the problem that I have with sentience, and maybe this is a bit of a side, that it just doesn't seem a concept that's too like robustly defined, and it seems like it's intuitive, right? So this actually ironically gets back to name the trait, right? Because you have this need to like identify all these traits and rigorously define them and see where in which they like they have their Achilles heel, so to speak, and you have like these issues with it, right? But it's funny because vegans never really seem to want to do the same with sentience, right? Because there's a cluster of, I could say, like if you really want to get down to the nitty gritty of it, it could be hundreds of thousands of traits that contribute to sentience. And it's kind of like how many of those traits could be exchanged or changed, what base traits actually are sentience. These are all really interesting questions. It kind of gets back into like what is a male or a female? Are those hard categories? Because it seems as if there's an exception in medicine. When you examine a male and female, there are exceptions all over the place, right? Like, are you a male if you have a penis? Well, if you don't have a penis, are you not a male? If I had my penis cut off tomorrow, would I not be a male anymore? These are interesting questions, and I feel like sentience kind of has the issue as well, where it's like, where do you draw the line? So, like, do you have like external facts that you could point to about sentience? Yeah, sure. Is it really hard to define sentience? Yeah. Is that an issue for people who push name the trait and kind of reject this intuitive kind of what is a human? Well, you have to rigorously define what a human is to propose that they are of moral value and animals aren't. Well, you need to rigorously define sentience before you can say that sentiocentrism is a valuable kind of asset in your moral tool belt. And you're saying that that's the ways in which I look at morality. Because if you're going to go down that line of reasoning where we can't intuit to any sort of categorization in this instance, then you would have to apply the same scrutiny to your moral framework, which includes sentience. So I think that that is actually another issue with name the trait. So just as a brief aside, if
yeah, I mean, the fact that there's several different, I guess, factors that come in when it comes to consciousness and therefore sentience, I don't think it's necessarily particularly relevant. I'm not sure you have to know down to the T what it is that creates consciousness and from there sentience. Even consciousness, when you look up the descriptions of it, it is just described as something that's incredibly hard to specifically describe unless you have it. There's obviously things you can point to and empirical evidence and obviously the inductive evidence. So things like the Cambridge Declaration of Consciousness, which I'm sure you're aware of.
But not too familiar with it.
The difficulty in defining it exactly doesn't necessarily mean like you have it, I have it. We can determine that other human beings have it. The fact that it's something that can be hard for the layman to explain, the fact that it can be hard for experts to explain, let alone the layman to explain, I don't think is a good reason to I guess, abandon it, or to say that it's not a great argument, because that is the thing that, when it really comes down to it, that's the thing that people genuinely tend to care about. Most people, at least.
I just want to say that I actually do think sentience is a valuable concept, right? Um, and my only argument there was that if you're concerned with, so like, let's say that I say that the trait is humanity, right? And then you ask me, what is humanity, right? You need to define what humanity is. And if you don't give me all the traits of humanity in an order in which I find pleasing, well, then I don't know what you're saying, and you're just appealing to something that I don't understand, right? Well, in the same way,
Yeah, I mean,
it
that
could be
gets,
said of, it could be
sorry,
said of,
just that's getting a bit nitpicky, because I mean, if it really came down to it, there's a case of your opponent being a little bit charitable, or not even an opponent, just the person that you're discussing it with being a bit charitable. So if you asked for what humanity is, you could look it up and give a general description. You don't have to give every single tiny piece of information of what it is to be in humanity or to be a part of humanity.
well, the problem is that
Yeah.
if you give just a couple baseline traits, is that they'll just kind of transpose that onto an animal, and it will become like absurd, right? So like if I give you like the entire, like if I got a biologist on here, right, and I gave you like the entire phenotypic like biology of a human, and you're just like, but what if that was a cow though? It's like, well, then you're just talking about a human, right? Like you're just saying, what if this cow was a human? It's like, well, then obviously I would want to you know have them live and not eat them. So it's really more about it's really more
Sorry, just
it's
if
I'm
they
just saying.
classified something in that way, that would literally be that thing. I'm not really sure how you could just say that that would be a cow, because if it's got the DNA of something, then that's what it is. It can't just be a cow. Might
I'm
be.
sorry, I'm confused as to what your objection is. I was just saying that if you name enough, like if you name enough traits, like let's say I give just a baseline application of like what a human is, right? And then you just transpose that onto like a cow, right? Like there's some like level of kind of obscurity in that definition to where they can still say that that's like, there's some parts of that that's like a pig, right? That they've like transposed these traits, and like there's a pig there, but like you're not willing to kill the pig, and like then you've like produced inconsistency or whatever, right? So to like really get around this, you would have to like really robustly define what human is. And then in that you would have them like kind of get into this absurd position. It's like, well, you want to kill X, right? Because you value A. Well, what if X was A? And then they're like, oh, I got you. It's like, well, then, you know what I'm saying? Like, you really need to robustly define it to win that argument. And that's what they're looking for, right? As a really robust definition that they can't really like wiggle out of, or like, you know, trade it and like make it kind of produce that absurdity. So that's all I'm getting at, right? I'm not getting at anything else when I'm talking about sentience and relation. Because again, it's like, if you want that level of detail, well, then I'm just saying that I want that level of detail. If I can't appeal to intuition in regards to humanity, if I can't just say, I know a human when I see them, right? Then, you know, kind of the same thing goes for sentience, right? Like you guys say, well, I just know a sentient person, or I see a sentient thing when I see one, right? So what I'm saying is I actually am I'm a fan of appealing to intuition.
Yeah, sorry, it's not intuition. I'm just, yeah. So
It's not intuition when you're appealing to sentience.
yeah, so I mean, you do. So even with sentience, I prefer to use consciousness, because when it comes to
Quality
something
of
like
consciousness, whatever, yeah.
yeah, consciousness, it is an inductive. It is something that's inductively reasoned, but you've got obviously you've got behavioral observations, you've got anatomical observations, you've now got neuroscience, advanced neuroscience. It's a different thing than that versus saying going into a toy store and seeing a toy that looks humanistic and moving around, but not having any of the relevant, I guess, anatomical requirements to be declared conscious, or having any of the neuroscientific backing to be declared conscious. There's a big. I don't see where anyone just says, "Well, it's my intuition that individual A there it has consciousness, but individual B over there does not.
Well, I think that certainly that's what you're saying, right? Like when you're looking at like a plant and you're like, well, that thing isn't, sentient. But when you look at like a fuzzy
Yes,
rabbit, you're saying that
plants
that
has
thing's sentient. But if you're appealing to like some sort of scientific
yes,
observation of inductive evidence, then obviously that's different. I just don't think that the majority of vegans are really even that aware of these things, right? That they are kind of intuiting to them. So that's kind of my point, right? And I'm not making really a scientific point. I'm actually, my point is that I'm fine with kind of intuitional assessments. So like if I
don't
see a human, I just know a
not
human when I see
necessarily.
them, right?
Yeah, so I'm not necessarily sure that that's a good way to go about it. So, I mean, the simple way for the plant thing is just literally go to Google Scholar and look up plant consciousness, and you're going to find close to nothing. Probably the only thing that you'll find is, I think the last time I checked, there was questions about what effect plants have on consciousness of human beings when they're put into a nursing home or some shit. Like it makes people less depressed or some shit like that. There's nothing about
Well,
plants having consciousness. There's actually no evidence at all to indicate plants have consciousness or anything that we would consider to be consciousness, where there is massive amounts of evidence to declare that animals have consciousness.
I just want to say that I'm not saying that plants are conscious. That's not what I was saying there.
No, no, I'm not saying.
Um,
Yeah, I'm not necessarily
yeah.
saying that. It's just I'm saying there is a big difference. It's not necessarily just a. I understand that you're saying there's a lot of vegans that make really bad arguments where they are using their intuitions, and
No, I'm actually saying that that's a good thing, right? Like I think that you pretty much approximate it a lot of times, right? Like when I say that like I just know a human when I see one, right? I actually think that that is in line with like scientific literature, right? Like when I see somebody who looks like a human, it's just likely that the person is a human, right? Like whether like a quadruped or like, whether or not they have some sort of like hideously deformed face or whatever, or if they're retarded, maybe even to the point where they can't communicate properly. I understand a human when I see one, right? And I think in the same way, a lot of vegans. I mean, there's something called like naive realism. So it's like the idea that I just kind of observe things and that's all I really know, right? Like, and I think a lot of times, I mean, you're not going to be able to observe all these instances. Science is pretty flawed in some ways. Although I am fully on the science train and even the induction train, even though it's got problems. But really, when you're appealing to intuition in terms of like moral evaluations, it's like, could that be flawed on like some level? Like if you're really getting nitpicky and scrutinizing it, sure. Um, is it really that problematic to everyday life and like reasoning? No. And also, I just want to say that like humans aren't really rational, right? Like by our very nature, we don't really rationalize to moral propositions. We just kind of emote to them. So this whole conception that you can like be really uber consistent and like rigorously define these things and you don't intuit to anything. I just don't, from what I know of, again, and this is, I'll defer to my own kind of scientific literature. There's a massive amount of evidence to show that humans just actively ignore certain parts of their psychology. They won't really seriously consider a lot of their moral, choices, decisions, thoughts, judgments, actions, all of these things. And I think there's something to be said for that.
yeah, I mean, let's just get a few things out. So, do you think it is bad or good for people to use their intuitions as part of their reasoning when they're making their decisions?
I mean, I think it depends, right? Like, I think that, like, it's kind of a loaded question.
Specifically, let's just say, as far as the argument for veganism goes, do you think it is bad or good for people to use their intuition when it comes to making the argument for veganism, specifically from the sentience argument?
Well, I feel like if you're going to appeal to sentience, I think that that's perfectly permissible. I think that if you're intuiting to what that is, and you kind of understand some fuzzy variables that contribute to sentience, that's perfectly fine, right? Even though it's kind of not robustly defined in some instances, even though it's got issues and it's really hard to describe what it is, I think it's fine to intuit to it. And in the same way, right, that a lot of vegans do that, I think it's fine for your average everyday person to understand what a human is intuitively and what an animal is intuitively, and understand, given their natural predilections, that they just value one over the other, right? And this kind of pedantic assessment of like, well, like how many traits can I name to make my super uber logical argument consistent is kind of ridiculous.
Okay, so I guess we'll move on more to a bit more towards name the trade, but you're happy for people to use their intuition that sentience is something that you can intuitively know and identify others who have sentience, and they can use that as a base for their argument.
I think that there's levels of analysis, right? So like I think that
Sorry, I just want to move on because I want to
sure,
finish this off in the next hour and a half if I can. So
I got you.
just sort of relatively simply, is it okay for people to use sentience? Oh, sorry, is it okay for people to use their intuition and use sentience and their intuition that others have sentience as an argument when they're defending veganism?
Sometimes, but not always.
Okay, I feel like that's an answer that could be a pretty easy yes or no.
I think that sometimes it's okay to intuit to that. I think if you're going to have a more rigorous or a scientific argument
Okay, so
and you're
let's
going
talk
to
about the
exchange
strongest
studies,
argument. If you were going to provide the strongest argument, do you
Mhm.
think intuition would work? So let's just go for the strongest argument.
Sure. If you're going to provide, I guess, from my perspective, what would be the strongest argument? I think you would want the most evidence available, right? Given uh, my kind of musings about the way the world works and like how I come to, the way truth is and stuff like that. Yeah, I think if you're going to make the fullest picture, I said multiple times, like most people when they're intuiting to these things, they kind of have blurry pictures of variables in their head. So yeah, like obviously, if you want to have a more, kind of in-depth discussion, you're probably going to be getting into a lot more of the scientific literature. You're probably going to be getting into a lot more scientific evidence, just outside of like your observations. So do I think for most things, it's okay, and it's even in some cases perfectly like logical to appeal to intuition? Yeah. Do I think that there are some discussions that call for more like rigorous scientific research? Yeah, I think both of those things could be true.
Okay, so let's just say, for the sake of the argument, the best way to make the argument for sentience is from a scientific based perspective, because that's what you would find more convincing. And you think that if vegans are going to argue for it, they should have a better understanding of science and have a robust understanding of it as they push forward.
Yeah, sure. But I just want to say for the record that I have no problem with people having an intuitive understanding of sentience in the same way that I have an intuitive understanding of what an animal is and what a human is, right? Or what a pig is in a human, for
Yeah,
instance.
I mean, we can. Yeah, I mean, if I'm talking to a normal person, let's just talking sort of informally, I'm obviously not going to point to massive amounts of evidence and say, "Oh, look at all this literature and this information and the Cambridge Declaration of Consciousness, et cetera, et cetera." Obviously, you can just have a general discussion, but if we're talking about a formal, strong argument, you would want lots of scientific evidence to back it.
Yeah, sure. If the argument is on the grounds, just to be fair here, if the argument's on the grounds that we're gonna really robustly define our terms as much as humanly possible, and we're gonna lay out as much scientific evidence as possible, then yeah, I'm fine with that. But if you see the way that name the trade is used, just to be fair here, like with Andy Worski, do you think the guy had any idea that he would have to have a robust amount of scientific evidence to counter Isaac's points, right? To kind of have this idea of human that is not only consistent, stands up to any scrutiny, but indeed convinces Isaac of his proposition. I don't think that like he was aware of this going into it. So It's like name the trade isn't always framed in this way, right? A lot of times it's framed pretty casually, and people answer casually, right? But then there's levels like where he goes up and he's like, well, what about this though? Well, what about this though? So he just kind of like marks it up depending on the level, like the level of knowledge that his interlocutor has. So
I'm not really seeing a problem with that, though, to be honest, because obviously you're going to talk to people based on their understanding of things, and you're going to talk to them at their level, and you're going to talk to them probably in a way that they're going to find most convincing. And if it's someone that can just have a casual conversation about it, I think, yeah, just have a casual conversation about it. But if someone's being particularly difficult, then you do have to start picking apart their position. I'm not really sure why. If you saw Andy Warski, I haven't seen the Andy Warski debate in a while. But if he was trying to be sort of sneaky or use some sort of underhanded, I don't want to say underhanded, but if he was using a specific trait which wasn't, I guess, the thing that he would actually value, then it's worth investigating whether that's the trait that he actually values or there's something underneath. So there's no problem with, I guess, exploring and testing out people's actual arguments.
Well, it's kind of like I wouldn't venture to say that it's like a fallacious changing of the goalpost, but it certainly is throwing people off guard when you're entering a discussion and you're expected to give kind of a short answer, like for instance, it's like I just humans the trait, humanity is the trait, and then they're like, but you have to give me all these variables and give me like this robust scientific definition. It's like, well, I was just intuiting to that, and like if it's firstly kind of proposed as if it's just a casual discussion,
you're talking about just random people, because it's there's a few times where you're sort of going between arguments that a whole variety of people make. And it's sort of going from like somebody who has very poor understanding or has a very poor grasp of the argument or argues from a very informal way all the way up to people who have a very formal way. So if you're saying one person is doing one thing, just stick on that one person. If you're talking about another.
Sure. Again, it kind of gets back into what we're talking about right now, which is I'm just intuiting to what like name the trait is, right? And the way I see it used the most times, and mostly the way that I see it used is pretty problematic. So that's what I'm talking about, right? So when you're proposing something,
an education thing for the general public, so people that use name the trait or become aware of it, they probably just have to understand it a bit better and maybe be educated a bit better into it. But yeah, I wouldn't view it.
Well, I'm just saying that there are people who use this argument
with the execution of the argument.
Well, there are people who use this argument who, like even Isaac, in some ways. I guess I could give you some examples in the future if you want, but where he's used this argument in equally as dishonest a way. And again, what I was saying was, and I was framing the whole Andy Warski thing for a purpose, right? Which is that Andy Warski isn't a smart guy. And that he probably didn't have a whole lot prepared in this whole vegan discussion. Right now, you could say that that's on him, but I would say that it's more of a problem of kind of the expectation, right? So if Isaac's really concerned with having this like uber rational scientific discussion, he really should preface that, right? That you are going to have to go through maybe even hundreds of traits to understand what a human is, right? And before that, then I'm just going to, transpose all these traits onto a cow. And if you don't accept it, then you're inconsistent, right? So like the level of expectation in these discussions really needs to be fleshed out. And I feel like even Isaac hasn't done that. That's why I gave that specific example, right? And I feel like he's routinely done this in discussion, where he's kind of, it's kind of like changing the goalpost. It isn't quite like that, but there's a level of expectation in discussion. I feel like it's not being quite met there.
I mean, the thing is with Warski, he did come in with the idea that it was going to be a debate. So I'm not really sure what the criticism of Isaac is with that one, because you're going to come in and if the person is not up to your standard, it's just going to show. So I don't really see why Isaac should, I guess, let him have a few points would be one way to put it, just for the sake of the fact that Warski isn't up to his level. So
it's not that he's not up to his level. It's that certain people need levels of they need a certain amount of prep time and a certain amount of expectation in a debate, right? So like typically
so that's on the opponent. So I don't
it isn't though, because you'll
debate you. and you say, okay, cool, but I'm going to look this up a bit more, then that's fine. But if you say, yeah, I'm good to take you whenever, then that's on you. You need to have that. Even then, if you get beaten in the debate, then it's on you to go back and do your research if you think that you have an argument. Okay, I don't really see the point why Isaac going into a debate, or any vegan going into a debate, has to be specifically charitable to their opponent. If the opponent wants to come back afterwards and say, hey, look, I want round 2 or round 3. I've done a bit more research. I've got more arguments. Like what's his name? I Hypocrite. He came back. I think he came back 2 or 3 times. He looked up what was it, theory of mind or something like that, and came back with that argument. So people are welcome to come back with more arguments, but it's not on the vegans' burden to come in with lowered level, like come in with oversized gloves and be overly charitable. It's on you. You're coming into a debate. It's on you.
Just to be clear here, I'm not making the argument that he should commit himself to having debates these ways, right? I'm just saying that typically, like like the Bill Nye versus Ken Ham debate, right? That there was some level of expectation. There wasn't a lot of time. There was a level of research that was given to both, and that's what a formal debate is, right? So the idea that like these are formal debates is kind of laughable. These are informal debates. And the thing about even informal debates is you kind of have to give your opponents a heads up, right? That's all I'm saying is, especially for somebody who and I know that you said that he's not on his level, right? But you need to kind of know that before you go into debate with somebody. If they're not quite giving you that level of like, well, this interlocutor quite isn't there, you might need to let him know ahead of time, hey, I'm going to hit you with these questions, right? And you might have to give certain answers to these questions and like more of a scientific background or whatever, right? And I would say that that's not being charitable, right? That's just being a good interlocutor. That's being somebody who knows how to discuss something with somebody who isn't trying to win points. So I think that's kind of what my point was roundabout. I'm not saying he has to do that, by the way. If he wants to be a dick, he can be a dick.
That's not even being a dick, because I think he did a discussion with Blair White after she made the announcement that she wasn't going to be vegan anymore, and he just discussed it with her very informally. And he never went. He just said to her, "Look, I'm not going to go into a debate mode with you or anything like that." And it was almost like a pleading when he was talking to her. Whereas with the rest of them, they knew what they were getting into. And again, if you didn't like how it ended up being, there's still the opportunity for round 2. Isaac has always given the opportunity. He gave it to Cognitive Thought. He gave it to iHip. He's given it to Andy Warski. He's given it to any of these guys. The option is open. If you want to come back for round 2, and if you want to do your research, go back and do it. Really,
Sure.
only one person's done it, which is iHip. I don't think it's on Isaac. Isaac has been very clear. He said, I want to have a debate with you. This is what the situation is. This is what we're discussing. And anyone that, if you are interested in him and if you're gonna challenge him, go do your research. Watch a few of his videos. If you look at him and go, oh fuck, this guy's too smart for me, then back out of it. Like if I went in and talked to, if I saw JHC and said, oh, JHC's a fucking moron, I'm gonna like absolutely demolish this guy in a philosophy debate. If I listened to the guy talking in Discord or wherever, and I went, oh shit, okay, maybe I talked a bit too quickly, I'll maybe back off a bit. It's not that hard to do a little bit of research, or to just say, hey, do you mind if we just have an informal discussion? The other thing Isaac obviously offers as well is, hey, if you really want, we can just do a private discussion, which what's her face? The girl that recently had a nutrition debate with Vegan Gains, she got destroyed pretty bad. She was on the verge of crying. iDubbbz's girlfriend, I can't remember her name. She Isaac offered to talk to her informally, and I think she took it up. So it's not on. I don't see how it's a burden on him to try and be nice. Like these people are adults. They have a responsibility to do their research, to know their arguments, to come in prepared. And if you come out looking unprepared or having bad arguments, you still have the option for round 2. So go away, do your research, come back for round 2.
Look, I'm not making the argument that he has to do these things. So I don't think that there's a burden placed on him or anything, right? I'm just simply saying, and what I'm saying isn't particularly controversial, right? That with engaging with these larger YouTubers, or even in some instances, just more casual things on Discord, that there's a level of expectation, I mean, at least in the schedule events, of understanding uh, what the discussion is going to be about and what the expectation is, right? So, like, if you're going to see his argument from like a video, like let's say I watched a couple Isaac videos, right, and I saw the name the trait argument. It's like, okay, I need to name the trait, right? And then it's like, but if I name like 10 human traits, he'll dismiss that on the grounds of collective traits, though, right? Like he'll literally say that. He'll say, well, just assortment of traits, though, right? Like these are like things that the interlocutor isn't aware of. So I feel like just giving a heads up saying, look, I'm going to need for you to win this argument, you're going to need to give me a robust definition, almost biological. You need to be like a biologist definition of like human to actually get out of this, right? I feel like the burden is on him in some sense in terms of like social norms to meet that, right? To give his opponent kind of a heads up because a lot of his videos don't go too much in depth of what like the larger kind of like caveats to his argument where he's like, you know, ramping up and he's going, but what about this though? But what about this though? And you're getting to the point where you just need to give every single trait of a human in depth. You need to examine them anatomically to make this distinction between animals and humans. So that's pretty much all I was saying, right? Was that there's like a norm obligation here. I'm not saying that there's like any sort of like this is true in all instances. You have to be this way with your interlocutors. I'm just saying that from my perspective, and I think from most people's perspective, it just seems kind of weird.
Yeah, I completely disagree. I mean, he's come in, he's been pretty transparent. That's a debate. So I don't really think that there's any extra burden on him to provide anything beforehand. And again, afterwards, if they want to come back for a second time, third time, it's perfectly on them. So yeah, we can move on from that if you want.
Yeah, sure. We can move on to something else. If you have something that criticism of me or anything else, you can go ahead and throw it at me. Um, I mean, really, a big issue I've had with this whole thing is in regards to, I mean, Isaac's a big part. I'd say he's the only one who's seriously advocating like argumentation for veganism and kind of seeing these pitfalls in the argument, and at least how it's being used in some cases being pretty problematic is pretty disheartening for me, right? Because I think, despite me going back to eating meat, I pretty much think veganism is the future, right? That most people in the future will probably be vegan, right? And it's pretty much inevitable because of lab grown meat, a lot of other things. Um, so it's sorry, I think it's really disheartening to see a lot of these uh, vegans arguing in ways that kind of catalyze people. Because if you've actually seen the way people actually think about Isaac, right? Like after they've had discussions with him where he's just yelled that they're a retard or a sophist or whatever. It's pretty disheartening. You get a very uncharitable interpretation of veganism coming out of those debates, and especially in regards to the people who tend to come, at the top of these movements. They just tend to be really unlikable. And a lot of the vegans who are casually kind of marketing it, like Khalil or somebody like that, which I guess you don't think she's vegan, but at least when she was vegan.
Come on, man.
but when she was vegan, I guess she was just
she ever?
casually.
If
I'd
you
say so.
to just randomly eat Snickers bars, then you don't really understand the whole thing. Like, I don't just if I go to a movies or whatever, I don't just go, yeah, fuck it, I'm just going to get a choc top because I know it's got dairy.
We could get into that discussion later, but a lot of the vegans who casually kind of advocate veganism, which there are a couple, they don't really seem to be. That's not the center point of their content, or
So
it's
that's a
not the
case of
main
marketing.
purpose.
Whereas, and this the thing is that those people are likable, just in general, or more likable, because anything that has a political connotation will immediately make that person more controversial, generally less marketable, and less likable. Veganism, it is literally just a political issue. There's no way to put it. It's a political issue. It's a ethical.
Yeah, sure, I agree.
And if it's an ethical position, if you immediately start talking about an ethical position, that will result in political, I guess, leanings, and that will result in people automatically putting up the defense walls. So we can talk about the different kinds of people who advocate veganism. Obviously, there's going to be people who are, the happy-go-lucky, and they just happen to eat everything and wear everything, and everything that they do just happens to be vegan products and all that. And there's going to be people that fall more along with those people, and they go, "Oh, this person's not really pushing our luck," and the softly approach certainly does work with a certain amount of people. The softly approach, where they just say, "Hey, there's this really good food, and do you want to try it? It's vegan, it's nice, blah blah blah." People go, "Oh, it's really nice. Oh, maybe I'll have this one. Maybe I'll have that one. Oh, vegan food isn't that bad. Oh, maybe I'll have a bit more," and so on and so forth. But then there's just a certain section, and I appreciate it. And a lot of people, if you go into someone like Vegan Gaines' channel, Vegan Gaines gets so much shit, and he got way more when he first started, and it started to become a lot more positive. The more you want to push it, the more you just have to be honest and just say, "Hey, this is really fucked up what we're doing," and you just have to be dead straight honest about it. And it doesn't mean that you're a dick. Like someone like Joey Carbstrong is pretty in your face. Even someone like Earthling Ed, the guy went to, I think, a university canteen, opened up a table and put up with this big poster that said, I think it said, you can't love animals and eat them. Change my mind. That's a pretty like, it's in your face. But Earthling Ed is not like a shitty person. He's not a over the top angry person. He's actually very reasonable. Same with Joey. I've talked to Joey. Really easygoing guy. But the fact that you're putting forward a very controversial issue, something that forces people to experience cognitive dissonance, it's going to be something that will result in volatile reactions. There's this thing called, I think it's called the backfire effect. The moment that you expose someone to something that causes them cognitive dissonance, a lot of the time they do dig further. But a lot of people, when they get the chance to walk away, when they feel the embarrassment and the shame of what it is that they do, then it forces them to think about what they're doing and go, "Hey, maybe this isn't who I like being. Maybe I need to change who I am. Maybe I need to change my actions. Maybe I have to consider how I think about things." So there's no nice way of doing that. I mean, short of us getting some Inception type method where we go into people's dreams and make them go vegan, you just have to say, "Hey, look, we're doing this really fucked up shit to animals. We should stop doing that." And there's no nice way to say that.
So all I was trying to get at there was that, like, for instance, I'll just give you an example, right? There's a chick who runs a YouTube channel, Maria the Witch, who came in the Discord server that I help run. And she had, I think she talked, I don't know if it was a public video or even maybe on Discord, she talked about an event in which she came in and had a mild disagreement with Isaac. And Isaac, in retort, decided to call her a cunt multiple times, mute her, talk over her, not allow her to fully flesh out her points. And I've talked to Maria the Witch. She's not an idiot, right? Like, she's not stupid. She could defend her own points. She's not inarticulate. She's not, but she got treated like complete crap and probably prejudged by Isaac. And that's all people really remember, right? Like unfortunately, that's how humans work,
actually,
right? It's like,
I was on that Discord, I think, when she came on. I'm pretty confident that I remember her. I think she got reduced to a position where she admitted that if she could profit off of child trafficking, she would think that would be ethical. She actually admitted to that, I think, within a minute or something like that. I remember listening to that. I think actually Seth, the programmer, was in on that as well. If she wants to have a talk with me, I'm happy to have a talk with her as well. But I pretty clearly remember her saying that she'd be okay with child trafficking.
Regardless, right? It's still wrong. Okay.
Let me know and get her to contact me if I'm wrong about that.
I will, but just to be clear, I don't know anything about that statement. I haven't seen any evidence of that. But what I will say is that, I mean, like, and for instance, like Vegan Gain saying that he's going to, take a baby and even as a joke and, hit them against a concrete until they're nothing blood and pulp. That's just, I mean, how does that look, right? And these are the people proposing, quote unquote arguments for veganism on a philosophical, moral level, on a political level. And I'd say that's pretty problematic, right? And I think Isaac's pretty indicative of that paradigm. And maybe he's a personification of it, right? Like in his overuse of like retards, like his complete unawareness of like it almost kind of ties back to Vegan Gains, where he doesn't understand why people would dislike him, right? And Isaac doesn't understand why people would dislike him, right? But of course, anybody who would look from the outside understands immediately why he's dislikable, right? He is over confrontational. He doesn't understand social cues. He doesn't know when to stop. And I think that's really problematic, right? And I think indicative of that is kind of this name the trade argument, how it's proposed, the kind of, the antagonism that comes along with it a lot of times, and the ways in which it's answered. And, it's interesting because all I'm doing is analyzing name the trade on a level of which name the trade analyzes other people's positions, right? And I found that it's inconsistent with itself, right? Coming back to kind of the more meta perspective of like how we select for what is good and what is bad, right? And kind of saying that preference justifies anything has two major issues that I pointed out previously. So I think it's really important to kind of stress the fact that not only is this guy extremely rude, right, but within his own argument, there are pretty severe miscalculations, misformulations that need to be accounted for in practical terms. I'm not saying how it's written at this point, because I think he actually did, with the help of JHC, rewrite the argument because he couldn't write it himself. So
I'm just going to put this up. I think I can do a screen share. So so I'm just going to put this up. This a lot of the people watching this will know already, but so I've got the common language one, which is up. I don't know if you can see it, but the viewers should be able to see it. So that's the common language one. It's essentially like I don't know if it'd be considered informal, but this was the original argument for name the trade, and then it ended up he sort of formalized it, and this is, I guess, the formal one. Can you see it?
Yes, I can. I can see the common language one at this moment. I can't see the formal one, I don't believe.
Let me just go back. I'll stop that and I'll just change it to, all right, this is the formal one. Oops.
But just to be clear, I'm not contending with how it's written as an argument. I'm just contending with the application, like in practical terms. I'm not really interested in nitpicking the language
too much anyway, but I'll put it up into the description box. But yeah, so yeah, he did formalize it, and he stated that the other one was a more common, I guess, language one.
Yeah, so it was a non sequitur, right?
No. It's a case of how to, I guess, it's one that would be better used for the lay person.
But I'm just to be clear, if it was put into formal argumentation and it was proposed as a formal argument, it would actually be a non sequitur, right? Because of the lack of.
I'm not sure that. I'm not sure. I have enough of the understanding.
Sure. Yeah. We'll maybe if you get into it a bit, we can have that discussion later. But it's irrelevant now because I think he's kind of implicitly admitted the argument was flawed, right? Because by changing it, he was vigorously defending it, right? But now he's changed it. So I think in that's the implicit kind of admission that it's not a formal argument. And why else would it not be a formal argument if it didn't have formal legs to sit on, right? Which it doesn't. So.
I'm not sure he ever stated that it was a formal argument. I think he said he stated that it was valid, which is different.
Valid how? That's completely vague.
The structure.
The structure. What does that mean?
Validity is related to the structure of the argument.
Explain like validity in terms of like first order logic, or like what?
Let's go.
Because if you break that down into a formula, it is a non sequitur because it doesn't account for the tying of traits to moral value.
Yeah, as far as I'm aware, I think JHC has actually looked over it, and he did. I'll have to double check, but I think he did say that it was valid instruction.
Well, look, whatever. I think if you're using inference rules, like certain things that I'm not aware of in logic, I think JHC probably came to that conclusion based on those. How it's written, if I put it into a formulae without making any sort of inferences about the language, it would definitely be a non sequitur. There's no question about that because there's no tying of traits to moral value. It's really problematic for it. Yeah. How it's written, at the very least.
All right, cool. Anything else that you want to go over? So maybe talk to Maria the Witch, and I'll have a talk with her, see what she says. But is there anything else you'd want to go over?
I mean, it's up to you, man. Do you have any? Because I didn't hear you really approach my preference argument, kind of the problematic ways in which people approach the my preference trait.
Yeah, so we can then just push on and just say, so with preferences, obviously there's a lot of things that you can have as preferences, but you would differentiate certain things as actually having a moral implication versus something that's just a preference. So I have a preference for certain flavors. So somebody might say, I have a preference for chocolate ice cream over vanilla ice cream, okay? I also have a preference for people to not be stabbed to death and just be murdered. One of those things has moral implications. Yep.
I think we could get into the distinction. I'm just not sure I want to define that at this very moment, because it would be so hard to define the difference between them.
I would just say, do you
think
it's
actually no, I'm going to insist on this. It's really hard to define in this scope of like, well, I think that categorically something is good, and deciding whether or not that does or doesn't have a moral implication. Because look, the thing is that me liking chocolate ice cream could have some consequential evaluation to it, right? So like, it's not only me liking ice cream, but it's that plus a consequence from that. So then that's a moral evaluation, right? From
okay,
root
so
to leaves. That's
say, okay. So without going into that, so how about just say, I have a preference for blue skies over rainy skies. So that's obviously something that's out of your control, and that it's not having any moral implication, really. Without
yeah, and inherently, I would at the very moment of which my present knowledge of this argument lies, I would agree with you, right? Like, I don't think that inherently has any moral implication, except for the fact.
It's just very simple. Like, you don't think that a blue sky versus a rainy sky has any great moral implication. Or if you're worried about rain, let's just say slightly cloudy sky.
It depends on like how you want to look at it, right? Because you could say that like the actual holding of the preference that you prefer a blue sky over a cloudy sky, right? You could say that holding of that preference in particular, inherently, if you just look at the holding of the preference, isn't moral. But the ways in which you evaluate how you preference a blue sky over a cloudy sky seems to be inherently tied with how you make moral calculations. So I'd say that that's the caveat, right? That the ways in which you prefer a blue sky to a cloudy sky is the same way that you prefer somebody not being stabbed over somebody being stabbed.
I don't think that's actually relevant at all, because you can just ask the person, do you think there's a moral implication of that? Because I'm not really worried about what it is that makes where they're getting that decision from. I'm just asking them, do you think there's a moral implication of a blue sky versus a slightly cloudy sky? Versus, do you think there's a moral implication between somebody being stabbed to death and not being stabbed to death?
Sure. To my present knowledge, I don't think so. I don't think there's any moral implication in the instance in where somebody says that they prefer a blue sky to a cloudy sky. I don't
Okay,
see any
there is a
reason to.
moral implication between being stabbed to death versus not being stabbed to death.
Yeah, there is a moral implication there. Sure.
Okay, so that would be where you would start with the preference argument, and then you'd push on from there.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, we can make that distinction and we can press on. And I think that, again, how you value things morally is based on, it's based on your mindset. So you are an agent, you are a person.
I don't think that particularly matters at all, because that's just getting into neuroscience, and it's not necessarily
Hmm?
relevant to. So when we're talking about the normative issues, I'm not really. I don't really care if you've got a slightly oversized part of brain or whatever. If you say something and you're honest about it, then I know that. I don't really care about, where do you have ancestors in Africa and therefore you've got this specific brain substrate, or
Sure.
recent ancestors in Africa, or does your mother have blonde hair and therefore you have these moral holdings, or whatever? Or
Yeah, I think that there's something to be said for
I'm
that, but
just
I'm not
asking,
getting into that.
do you think that you have certain preferences which have a moral implication, whereas other preferences don't have a moral implication?
I would say so to my
Yeah.
current knowledge
Okay.
at
So
this very
from there, if
moment.
somebody just says, I have a preference for X, then we just have to go into, do you think there's a moral implication for somebody being stabbed to death versus not being stabbed to death, and just go down the trait route?
Well, why would that negate the argument?
In what way? Well, what do
Like,
you
how would that negate my argument, just to be clear?
Okay, so are you arguing that somehow stating my preferences is an argument that gets away from moral discussion?
Uh, if you allow for intuitive answers, yes. If you're trying to have a rigorous scientific discussion,
So I'm not
and
talking about
you're
science.
only going to settle on that, then yeah, sure. That
Your normative ethics. Do you think just saying my preferences though suddenly takes away all sort of moral discussion?
sure. I'll go ahead and tell you what I think. I think that if I say that something is, let's just say, use the word a categorical good to me, right, which is the same as preference to me. If I think that something's categorically good, so for instance, I think eating meat is a categorical good. Like I look at that and I cognitively assign a good value to that, right? I think that that is perfectly, uh, that does kind of negate in an intuitive sense and a lack of kind of like a scientific sense. It's perfectly permissible to say that in like a philosophical, like moral discussion. In terms of like the levels of it, like so you have criteria in a discussion. So if you have a scientific criterion, then obviously that doesn't apply. If you want to get more in depth into it, then obviously that
I'm
doesn't
just
apply.
asking your normative beliefs. So I'm just asking you, do you think that just saying my preference suddenly means that something doesn't have, or that there's no reason to discuss morality? So, for example, if I said I have a preference for chocolate ice cream versus vanilla ice cream, do you think that that is somehow similar to me saying I have a preference for my mum not being murdered?
I think that look, I certainly think that there is a place, right, for further evaluation.
Okay,
Do I
I'm
think that
going to
saying
ask you a couple of simple questions. Okay,
sure?
would you say that you so is there somebody that you love? So do you know your mum? Do you love her?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you have a preference for her to not be murdered?
Yes.
Okay. Do you think it would be immoral for her to be murdered?
I think it would be bad.
Okay.
So
I'm just
yes.
going to ask you again. Do you think it would be immoral for your mum to be murdered?
Uh, I'm not sure I'm on board with the word, but sure.
No, I want a clear answer to that. So this is where people try the whole preference thing, but it just gets a little bit embarrassing. So I just want you to clearly tell me whether you would think it would be immoral for somebody to murder your mum.
Sure. Why
Okay,
not?
then it's now. Do you think it would be immoral for me to eat vanilla ice cream? Or let's just say, what's your favorite flavor of ice cream, and what's a flavor of ice cream that you think isn't that great?
Uh, I like chocolate ice cream, and I dislike probably like orange sherbet, let's say.
Okay. Do you think there's a moral implication between those two in any way that could be compared to somebody murdering your mum? Taking away all environmental effects,
Yeah,
taking
all
away
environmental effects. Yeah,
any
sure.
factors.
Yeah, there's no really any moral implication there. What's the point of this line of reasoning? I'm just curious.
I just don't understand when people just say the my preferences argument, because eventually you do get to a point where you're asking them, well, there are things that you hold which are preferences, and there are things that you hold which are preferences which have moral implication. And then once we figure
Yeah.
out what it is that you have your moral things that you hold that are moral implications, then from there we can push on into the name the trade argument.
Wait. How does this dismiss my argument, right? Because I've come to a moral formulation, right? So we're not having a rigorous scientific discussion, right? We're having just a casual discussion. We're kind of just working in general terms that we understand, right? Like we're working off the assessment that when I say like pig, we know what we mean, and when I say human, we know what we mean, right? So now all I'm saying to this argument is that I have a preference. Hold on, that I have a preference. It's my preference, right? I've proposed it, and if they say, well, you see, that's problematic because my preference can justify anything, right? The problem with that line of reasoning is that exact same criticism could be laid at the feet of the vegan, right? Because what they're saying is that because something is sentient, that it is deserving of moral value, right? Which is to just say that in my assessment, right, inductively, in terms of like what I've come across, what they're really saying is, I think sentience is good, right? And I think it's good to such an extent that I think it's better than other things, right? And I treat them differently based on that. So, it's basically the same, right? It's just two ends of the, it's opposite side of the same coin, right? It's, that's my argument, right? Is that the criticism that my preference justifies anything is inconsistent with itself when it's coming from a vegan, right? Because, they're using preferences.
They are using preferences. Well, obviously, vegans have preferences, but they also do prefer not to do things, or they avoid doing things based on moral implications of things. So, if the question of when you're asserting my preferences, the basic question is, if somebody just said I have a preference for murdering and eating humans, would that be acceptable? Then the person may say, well, yes, which obviously reduces to which is the reductio, or they'll say no. So it's not just a simple my preferences. It then becomes something that you have to analyze a bit further. But just my preferences is not an argument.
Yeah, it is. Hold on, and I'll tell you why. No, listen, you can't just say, right? Like, do you think it's permissible for somebody else to use my preference to justify their action? Because you're not saying that preference is the means by which something is moral or immoral. You're saying that my preference is what makes something moral or immoral. So why would somebody purposefully advocate against their own preferences if they are saying that their preferences are the arbiter of what is moral and immoral? This makes no sense.
Yeah. So if somebody asserts my preference, then they have to allow. If you're talking about just my preference as a total umbrella reasoning, then to avoid a double standard, all they have to do is just say everyone can walk around doing whatever their preferences allows for them to do.
Why would they say that?
Because
that makes no sense. They're saying,
yep, go on.
sorry. They're saying that it's my preference, right? They're not saying that it's other people's preferences. It's not saying my preference plus other people's preferences in all instances being allowed to do what their preferences comport to. They're saying what makes something moral or immoral is the cognitive categorization. They're saying that I find things to be good, I find things to be bad, right? So things that could be good or bad in somebody's eyes could be Jimmy murdering somebody down the street for a candy bar, right? But I could still think that Jimmy is bad, even though I'm using my preferences, because my preferences don't allow for Jimmy's preferences. There's no double standard. There's just the standard, which is my preference. This criticism is a textbook non sequitur because you are not following from the law of identity. If I've proposed that my preference is the arbiter, you can't appeal to somebody else's preference or say that I am creating a double standard because if you say that I am creating a double standard, right, you are saying that these are two fundamentally different, that they're two fundamentally different, the same thing, like they're the same preference, right? And
No,
that's
because when you say my preferences, then there's two things that go ahead. Either you have to assert that everybody has to do the things that are within your preference, or you have to allow others to do what is within their preference. So if you just say I have a preference for X, then it then follows that everybody should do the things that are within your preferential system, which is basically, I guess, getting towards egoism.
you don't have to prescribe it. Just to be clear, you don't have to prescribe it. You can say that my preference is what makes it okay to eat meat, but you don't have to say that because of that, in all instances in which my preferences are comporting, like that means that everybody else needs to comport to that preference, right? Like that's problematic, because you can say that, like, in some instances I have a preference that people shouldn't murder. In that case, other people, that's like directly saying people can't murder, right? If you have a preference to eat meat, you personally, that isn't saying that everybody else should eat meat. So there's exceptions to this. It's not just as simple as, everybody needs to ride to the tune of your preferences. My preferences can still allow for variation between people, because a preference can be like, hey, in some instances I'm fine with people doing differently than me. That could be a preference. So this is not a sound line of reasoning. It doesn't work.
Okay, so if I have a preference for Jimmy to not stab fucking Steve, but Jimmy has a preference to stab Steve, what's the go?
Mm-hmm. What's the what?
What's the go? What's the go?
The go is, right, is that you've said that my preference is what makes something right or wrong, right? So you'd say that it'd be bad if Jimmy did that, right? And you may even go as far as to say that I really don't want Jimmy to do that. And you may even go as far as to say as I want the police to stop Jimmy from doing that, right? But you may also have different preferences. You may say, like, I like chocolate ice cream, but that doesn't bar people from not enjoying other different kinds of ice cream than chocolate, because there's nothing prescriptively inclined in that statement that allows people, no kind of autonomy to choose what flavor ice cream they like.
Okay.
So this kind of straw man that you've constructed, that there's like
10 minutes as well. But it's just going to go back to the cycle of, do you think there's a moral difference between Jimmy stabbing Steve, and do you think there's a moral implication between your preference for chocolate ice cream?
I don't see how this is relational to the criticism, right? Because you said that to justify the my preference trait, that you would have to either say that everybody can conform to their own preferences and that's permissible, or everybody has to kowtow to your preferences. But that does not follow, right? Because your preferences could just be prescribing things for you to do, right? And could still allow room for other people to act on their preferences as well, right?
Yeah,
so, like,
so
for
some
instance,
of your preferences, though, will be things that will restrict other people's preferences, correct?
sure, right?
Yep.
But that doesn't mean that everybody needs to conform to my preferences. It's just that there are some
If you're
preferences that
going
they
to
might have to
restrict
conform
other
to.
people's preferences, then what's that?
Sorry, what? Say that one more time.
If your preferences are going to result in other people's preferences being restricted, then what happens there?
Well, typically then you form societies based on popular opinion. You come to consensus about, like, is it okay to murder people? Well,
Okay, and what would
gee,
those kinds
that's
of
not.
preferences be? So would they be categorically different from your ice cream preference?
Sure, yeah.
Okay, so what would you think those things are?
What do you mean? What
So
would you think? What is?
what would be what kind of word would you use to say I have a preference for certain people's preferences to not go ahead? For example, I have a preference for Jimmy not being allowed to stab Steve. Therefore, I want to conduct a society whereby Jimmy is not allowed to stab Steve. What would your internal preference for that be, for something that you're going to push forward versus I have a desire for chocolate ice cream, but I don't have a problem with other people eating sherbet ice cream, and I'm not going to try and push society to restrict other people from their preference of eating sherbet ice cream. Okay, what word would you use to describe Jimmy being restricted from stabbing Steve?
What word would I use? I would I would just describe it how you described it, right? I don't know if I'd put it in a word, but I just say that I think
The word I'd use is probably morality. So it'd be my morals. Okay.
sure you can assign any word to it.
I have a moral, I guess you could say, preference to stop Jimmy stabbing Steve. Okay. And then from my
Sure.
moral preference, I would then try and create a society which agrees with my preference, because this is currently restricting Jimmy's preference to stab Steve. Okay.
Okay, so just to be clear,
Between the two.
so yeah, sure, I agree with you, but there is a difference between liking ice cream and wanting, Jimmy to not stab Timmy, right? There's a difference there. But just to be clear, it doesn't sound to denounce my preference, right? Because everybody uses my preference in moral reasoning. So are we in agreement on that?
Are you going to stop people from eating orange sherbet? Are you going to create a society that stops people from eating orange sherbet?
I don't understand how this relates.
That's the answer to the question here. So would you push for a society that stops people from eating orange sherbet ice cream?
I don't understand the how this relates to my criticism.
Would you create a society which restricts people's desire and their preference to eat orange sherbet ice cream?
No.
Okay. Would you want to create a society which restricts Jimmy from stabbing Steve?
Sure, yeah.
Okay. So you're stopping one group of people from doing one thing, or one person from doing one thing, but you're not restricting another person from doing another thing. Yep. So there is a difference between the two.
Yeah, there is. I think I've
I
said
would
that
call that
before.
morality, and I think a lot of people would just call that morality.
You could call that morality, you could call it anything. But the bottom
That's the
line
problem
here is
with the preference argument, is because there's a difference between our preference for chocolate ice cream and orange sherbet ice cream and letting Jimmy stab Steve.
sure, we can make that distinction. You can say you have moral preferences. You could say that you have more benign, self-affirming preferences. You could say that you have preferences towards other things, like external things. Like I like the beauty of seeing the Grand Canyon in front of me. Like there's obviously categorical differences here.
Moral implication that would you want to restrict people from seeing the Grand Canyon?
Would I want to restrict people from seeing the Grand Canyon? No. What's the purpose of this? I don't know how this gets to my argument, right? Because in the discussion of, I think that animals should be preserved and not killed. That's a syntiocentric point of view, right? Like from a vegan's perspective, or at least some vegans' perspective. Not
Yes,
all.
you've already stated that you have a preference to stop Jimmy from stabbing Steve. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So from there, would you have a preference from Jimmy restricting Jimmy from stabbing his cushion in his own house, if that's what he enjoys doing?
No, but this isn't the question, right? The question is from the person who's proposing name the trait, right? Because what they're saying is
that's where we get to name the trait. So you don't have a problem with Jimmy stabbing a cushion in his house, but you have a problem with Jimmy stabbing Steve. And then in between that, we can just say, do you have a problem with Jimmy stabbing stabbing a pig, or paying for someone to stab a pig? And then we just go down the name the trait route.
No, I have no problem with that. But that's just because, again, it's just my preferences, right?
Yep, and you have preferences to stop Jimmy stabbing Steve.
Sure, but what's the problem with that? This is kind of what I'm trying to say, right? Is that everybody has certain assignments of my preference to moral kind of outlooks. So what the vegan is saying in some instances is that they're sentiocentric, right? And that they value sentience, right? But the same means by which they value sentience is the same means by which I value the taste pleasure of eating meat and, all of those things. So if you're going to condemn my preferences for, placing animals out of moral value and humans in moral value, based on the fact that it is a preference, then you're going to have to condemn your own worldview.
Substress that result in you having preferences is different from you saying that there's a categorical difference between moral actions and actions that have no moral implications. There's clearly a difference between the two. And the fact that they all arise from preferences or some level of preferences is irrelevant, because you can label one thing as, you would actually label one thing as having a moral implication, whereas other things don't have moral.
Yeah, but both of these things have moral implications. by definition, syntheocentrism has moral implications. If you are a vegan and you are a vegan on the terms that you are a syntheocentric, that is a preference towards a moral good, towards a categorical good. In the same way,
Sentience is an
me,
axiom which I guess expresses your moral preferences would be one way to put it. But I don't see how in any way just saying I have a preference for eating meat. It's just a complete nothing argument.
the problem, it isn't, right? Because what I'm saying is, if you'd allow me to finish, is that the criticism, right, from the vegan in the name the trade argument, saying that it's problematic that I am using my preference to justify including humans within moral value and precluding animals, saying that my preference is problematic in that instance, necessarily, if you are actually being consistent, necessarily makes the instance in where somebody says, I'm a syntiocentric, I think sentience is at the epicenter of what moral value entails, right? You need to necessarily condemn your own position if you're trying to be consistent, because you are valuing sentience based on a preference. That's my argument.
Okay. I might just end it somewhere around here. And I guess if we can do this again later if you want, or if you can
Okay,
get
doke.
with I guess Maria the Witch, and I'm happy to have her on and have a talk with her. But yeah, thanks for coming on anyway, man.
Will do, man. Thanks for having me.
All right, do you have any final thoughts or anything like that, or do you want to say anything, or you happy to end it here?
I'm happy to end it here.
All right, cool. I'll talk to you next time.
See you, man.